I never thought my own daughters would deny me the chance to say goodbye to my husband of 47 years. But what they didn't know was that Harold and I had been preparing for this moment longer than they could imagine. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is not just a story, it's a reckoning. Comment below where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. My name is Margaret Whitfield, and at 73 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of heartbreak. I was wrong. 3 weeks ago, my beloved Harold passed away after a long battle with cancer. As I sat in our empty house in Millbrook, Ohio, the silence felt deafening. The phone rang. It was my eldest daughter, Sandra. "Mom, we've made arrangements for Dad's funeral. It's tomorrow at 2. Tomorrow? Sandra, why wasn't I consulted? I'm his wife. We thought it would be too stressful for you. Just rest." Something cold settled in my stomach. What do you mean, rest? I'm attending my husband's funeral. Actually, Mom, we think it's best if you don't come. You've been so emotional lately. We don't want you making a scene. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, unable to process what had just happened. My daughters, Sandra and Patricia, had just banned me from my own husband's funeral. The man I'd loved since I was 26 years old, the father of their children, and they didn't want me there. I should have seen this coming. The signs had been there for months, but I'd been too focused on caring for Harold to notice the web my daughters were weaving around us. Sandra, 45 and married to that snake Richard, had always been the controlling one. Patricia, 42, just followed her sister's lead like she'd done since childhood. It started small. "Mom, you shouldn't be handling Dad's medications. Let us take care of that." Then it escalated. "Mom, maybe you should let us handle the finances while Dad's sick. You're under so much stress." Harold tried to warn me. Even through his pain medication haze, he'd grab my hand and whisper, "Maggie, watch out for the girls. They're not who we thought they were." I'd brushed it off. These were our children. The babies I'd rocked to sleep, the toddlers whose scraped knees I'd kissed better, the teenagers I'd supported through heartbreak and triumph. Surely Harold's illness was just making him paranoid. The day after Sandra's phone call about the funeral, I drove to Millbrook Cemetery anyway. I hid behind an oak tree, watching as they lowered my husband into the ground. Sandra wore my grandmother's pearl necklace, the one I'd been saving for a special occasion. Patricia carried Harold's favorite Bible, the one with his handwritten notes in the margins. They buried him without me. My children, my own flesh and blood, treated me like a stranger. As dirt hit the coffin, I made myself a promise. This wasn't over. That evening, Richard called me. "Margaret, we need to talk." Richard's voice dripped with false sympathy as he spoke. "Margaret, I know this is difficult, but there are legal matters we need to discuss. Harold's will needs to be read." "Of course. When do we meet?" "Well, that's the thing. The reading is only for beneficiaries named in the will. Don't worry, we'll make sure you're taken care of." My blood ran cold. I'm his wife, Richard. Of course I'm in the will. "I'm sorry, Margaret, but you're not listed. Harold must have forgotten to update it after your memory started getting fuzzy." My memory? I had the sharpest mind of anyone in my book club. I balanced our checkbook to the penny every month. I managed Harold's complex medication schedule without a single mistake. But my daughters had been planting seeds, telling people I was declining. The will reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Hartman and Associates law firm on Main Street. I'd been going to Bob Hartman for 20 years. He'd drawn up our original wills, handled our house purchase, and helped us with Harold's business incorporation. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzly. I sat in my car across from the law office, watching my daughters and their husbands stride confidently through the glass doors. Sandra wore her best black suit, the one I'd helped her pick out for her job promotion. Patricia clutched her purse like it contained the crown jewels. I waited 5 minutes, then walked across the street. The receptionist looked uncomfortable when she saw me. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm sorry, but this meeting is private. I'm here to see Bob. He's in the conference room with your family." I could hear muffled voices through the heavy oak door. Taking a deep breath, I knocked firmly and walked in without waiting for an answer. The conference room fell silent as I entered. Sandra's face flushed red, Patricia looked guilty, and their husbands, Richard and Tom, exchanged knowing glances. Bob Hartman, silver-haired and kind-eyed, looked genuinely surprised to see me. "Margaret. I thought you weren't feeling well enough to attend." "Who told you that?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Sandra stood up, her voice sharp. "Mom, we explained this. This meeting is only for the heirs named in the will." She smiled then, a cold, calculating smile I'd never seen before. "We didn't want to upset you unnecessarily." Patricia nodded, avoiding my eyes. "It's better this way, Mom. Less stressful for everyone." Richard leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "The will is very clear about the beneficiaries. Harold was quite specific about his wishes. They were enjoying this. My own daughters were savoring my humiliation, my exclusion from my husband's final wishes. 47 years of marriage, and they expected me to believe Harold had left me nothing." Bob cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should postpone this until—" "No," I said quietly, reaching into my purse. "I think we should proceed. But first, I have something that might interest you, Bob." I pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents, and placed it carefully on the polished conference table. The room seemed to hold its breath. "What's that?" Sandra's voice had lost some of its confidence. I said nothing. I simply pushed the folder across the table to Bob, who opened it with professional curiosity. As his eyes scanned the first document, his expression changed completely. His face went pale, then flushed, then settled into something I can only describe as amazement. "Margaret, where did you get these?" Sandra and Patricia leaned forward, trying to see what had captured the lawyer's attention so completely. Bob Hartman's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the first document from my folder. It was a will, Harold's real will, dated just 3 months before his death. But that wasn't what made him gasp. This is in Harold's handwriting. Every word." Bob looked up at me with new respect. "A holographic will, completely legal and valid." Sandra jumped to her feet. "That's impossible. Dad could barely hold a pen toward the end." "He wrote it during his good days," I said calmly. "When the pain medication wasn't clouding his mind. He was very deliberate about it." Patricia's voice came out as a whisper. "What does it say?" Bob began reading Harold's careful script aloud. "I, Harold James Whitfield, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils. To my beloved wife Margaret Rose Whitfield, I leave our home at 247 Maple Street, our joint savings accounts, my life insurance policy, and my IRA accounts, totaling approximately $847,000. Richard shot up from his chair. "That can't be right. Harold promised us." "Harold promised you what?" I asked sweetly. Bob continued reading. To my daughter Sandra Marie Henderson, I leave my 1967 Mustang and my tool collection, valued at approximately $15,000. To my daughter Patricia and Morrison, I leave my fishing boat and equipment, valued at approximately $12,000. The silence in the room was deafening. Sandra's face had gone from red to white to green. Patricia started crying, not the gentle tears of grief, but the ugly sobs of someone whose world had just collapsed. "This is fraud," Richard snarled. "Margaret forced him to write this while he was dying." "Actually," Bob said, still examining the document, "there's more." Harold included a letter explaining his reasoning. He cleared his throat and continued reading Harold's words. "My daughters have shown their true character during my illness. They have attempted to isolate my wife, spread lies about her mental capacity, and manipulate our family finances for their own benefit." Bob's voice grew stronger as he read Harold's letter, as if my husband's words were giving him courage. "I have observed Sandra and Patricia's behavior toward Margaret with growing concern. They have told neighbors and friends that Margaret is suffering from dementia, which is completely false." Patricia's sobbing intensified. Sandra stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Harold's letter continued. "On March 15th, I witnessed Sandra removing jewelry from Margaret's jewelry box while Margaret was at the grocery store. When confronted, Sandra claimed Margaret had given her permission, which Margaret later denied. I remembered that day. I'd been searching everywhere for my mother's diamond bracelet. On March 22nd, I overheard a phone conversation between Richard and Patricia's husband Tom, discussing plans to have Margaret declared incompetent so they could control our assets." Tom jumped up from his chair. "That's a lie. Harold was hallucinating from the drugs." But Bob wasn't finished. On April 2nd, Sandra convinced Margaret to sign financial documents, claiming they were insurance forms. These were actually power of attorney papers that would have given Sandra control over our accounts. My heart pounded as I remembered that afternoon. Sandra had rushed over with a stack of papers, insisting I sign them quickly because the insurance company needed them by 5 o'clock. Something had felt wrong, so I'd only signed the first page before making an excuse to stop. Harold was very thorough, Bob observed, flipping through more pages. He documented dates, times, and witnesses to numerous incidents of financial manipulation and emotional abuse. Sandra finally found her voice. "This is all lies." Dad was sick, confused. He didn't know what he was doing. I reached into my purse again and pulled out a small digital recorder, the one Harold had given me for Christmas last year so I could record grocery lists. "Actually, Sandra, your father was quite lucid when he recorded this message. Would you like to hear it?" The blood drained from both my daughters' faces. I pressed play on the recorder, and Harold's voice filled the conference room. Despite his illness, his words were clear and strong. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone and Margaret is having to defend herself against our daughters. Sandra, Patricia, I love you both, but your behavior these past months has broken my heart." Patricia's sobs turned to wails. Sandra sat down heavily, all the fight gone out of her. Harold's recorded voice continued. "I've watched you manipulate your mother, lie about her mental state, and scheme to steal her inheritance. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think 47 years of marriage made me blind to my wife's true character?" Richard started toward the recorder, but Bob held up his hand. "Let it play. Margaret has been nothing but devoted. When I needed help with medication, she learned everything about my condition. When I couldn't sleep, she stayed awake with me. When I was afraid, she held my hand and sang the songs we danced to when we were young. I wiped away tears, remembering those long nights when Harold couldn't rest. Sandra, you told the Hendersons that your mother was losing it. You told Dr. Williams that she was forgetting to give me my pills. You planted doubt everywhere you went, preparing the ground for your theft." Sandra was crying now too, but I felt no satisfaction in it. Only sadness for what we'd lost. "Patricia, you were weaker but just as guilty. You let Sandra lead you into this betrayal instead of protecting your mother when she needed you most. Harold's voice grew stronger, more determined. So here's what's going to happen. Margaret gets everything. You get what you deserve, very little, and a lesson in consequences. The recording ended. The silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of broken family bonds. Bob cleared his throat. There's also this. He pulled out another document. A restraining order Harold filed 2 weeks before he died. The restraining order lay on the conference table like a bomb waiting to explode. Bob adjusted his glasses and read the legal document with professional detachment, but I could see the disgust in his eyes. Harold filed this restraining order against Sandra Henderson and Patricia Morrison on behalf of himself and Margaret Whitfield. The court granted it based on evidence of financial exploitation and elder abuse. Sandra's voice came out as a croak. Elder abuse? That's ridiculous. The court didn't think so, Bob replied. Harold provided extensive documentation. Photographs of missing items from your mother's jewelry box, bank records showing unauthorized attempts to access accounts, and sworn statements from 3 neighbors who witnessed your verbal abuse of Margaret. I remembered those photographs. Harold had been so methodical, documenting every missing piece of jewelry, every family heirloom that had mysteriously disappeared when the girls visited. Richard stood up, his face red with anger. This is all fabricated. Harold was dying, he was confused. Actually, Bob interrupted, the court ordered a mental competency evaluation for Harold before granting the restraining order. He passed with flying colors. The doctor noted that Harold was remarkably sharp and coherent for a man in his condition. Patricia looked up through her tears. What does the restraining order say? Bob read from the document, Sandra Henderson and Patricia Morrison are prohibited from entering the Whitfield property at 247 Maple Street. They are prohibited from contacting Margaret Whitfield directly or through third parties. They are prohibited from accessing any financial accounts belonging to Harold or Margaret Whitfield. Tom stood up abruptly. We're leaving. This is harassment. Sit down, Bob commanded with surprising authority. We're not finished. There's one more document. He pulled out a letter addressed to me in Harold's handwriting. Margaret, Harold left this for you to read after the will was executed. He wanted you to understand the full scope of what your daughters were planning. My hands shook as I took the letter. Harold's handwriting, familiar as my own, filled 2 pages with revelations that made my blood run cold. The letter began, My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, then our girls have shown their true faces. I read Harold's letter silently first, my hands trembling with each revelation. Then, looking up at my daughters' pale faces, I decided they needed to hear their father's final words. My dearest Maggie, I began, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to choke me. If you're reading this, then our girls have shown their true faces. What I'm about to tell you will hurt, but you need to know the truth about what they were planning. Sandra started to protest, but Bob silenced her with a look. On April 10th, I overheard Sandra and Richard discussing nursing homes. Not for when you might need care someday, but for immediately after my death. They had already visited 3 facilities and put down deposits. The words hit me like physical blows. Patricia covered her face with her hands. They planned to have you declared incompetent within a week of my funeral. Richard had already consulted with a lawyer about the process. They were going to claim you were too grief-stricken to make rational decisions. I looked up at Richard, who was staring at the table. Is that true, Richard? He didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. I continued reading Harold's letter. Sandra stole your mother's jewelry, Maggie. Not just the pieces you noticed. She's been taking items for 6 months, selling them to pay for Richard's gambling debts. Sandra's head snapped up. Dad was hallucinating. Richard doesn't gamble. But Richard's face told a different story. The shame and fear in his eyes confirmed Harold's words. The poker debts total $67,000. Sandra was counting on your inheritance to pay them off. She thought if they could get you committed, they could access your accounts as your guardians. The room spun around me. My own daughters had planned to steal my freedom, my home, my dignity, all to pay for Richard's addiction. I've prepared for this, Maggie. Every legal document they'll need has been changed. Every account has been secured. And there's one more surprise waiting for them. I folded Harold's letter carefully and looked at my daughters. For the first time in months, I felt powerful instead of manipulated. Bob, what's this surprise Harold mentioned? Bob smiled grimly and pulled out yet another document from my folder. Harold hired a private investigator 3 months ago. He wanted documentation of everything Sandra and Richard were doing. Sandra jumped up. That's illegal. Actually, it's not. The investigator only observed public behavior and followed money trails that Harold had legal right to investigate as an account holder. Bob opened a thick manila envelope and spread photographs across the table. These show Sandra entering a pawn shop on 4 separate occasions. Here she is selling your grandmother's ring, your mother's necklace, and several other pieces of jewelry. The photographs were damning. Clear images of Sandra handing over items I cherished, receiving cash, walking away without a care in the world. The investigator also documented Richard's gambling activities. Casino records show he's lost $78,000 in the past year, not the $67,000 Harold mentioned. Apparently the debts were growing. Tom looked sick. Pat, you knew about this? Patricia shook her head frantically. I thought Sandra was borrowing money from Mom temporarily. She said Mom wanted to help with Richard's business investments. There were no business investments, Bob continued. Richard lost his job 8 months ago and has been gambling away their savings trying to win it back. Richard slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. I was going to pay it all back. With my money, I said quietly. With the money Harold spent 47 years earning and saving. Bob wasn't finished. The investigator also recorded conversations. Sandra, you told 3 different people that your mother was developing Alzheimer's disease. You specifically used those words to Dr. Williams, Mrs. Henderson next door, and your mother's bank manager. Sandra was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration at being caught. We needed help, she screamed. Richard's going to lose everything. So you decided to destroy your mother's life to save Richard's gambling addiction? Bob's voice was cold with disgust. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 73 years, but also feeling stronger than I had in months. Get out, I said quietly. What? Sandra looked up at me through her tears, as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. I said get out. All of you. Leave now. Richard started to say something, but I held up my hand. The restraining order is still in effect. If you don't leave immediately, I'll call the police. Patricia stood up slowly. Mom, we can work this out. We're family. The word family hit me like a slap. Family doesn't steal from each other, Patricia. Family doesn't lie about mental illness to destroy someone's reputation. Family doesn't plan to have their own mother locked away in a nursing home. Tom took Patricia's arm gently. Unlike Richard, he seemed genuinely shocked by what he'd learned. Come on, Pat. We need to go. Sandra wasn't giving up so easily. You can't cut us off completely. We're your daughters. Dad wouldn't really want this. I walked to the conference room window and looked out at Main Street, where Harold and I had walked hand in hand for decades. Where we'd built a life, raised children, and believed in the goodness of family. "Your father wanted exactly this," I said without turning around. "He wanted consequences for your actions. He wanted me protected from your greed." Bob cleared his throat. "There's one more thing. Harold set up a trust for any future grandchildren, but Sandra and Patricia cannot access it. If they have children who want a relationship with Margaret when they turn 18, the trust will pay for their college education." Sandra's voice turned vicious. "So you're punishing our children too?" I turned back to face her. "I'm protecting them from learning that stealing and lying are acceptable. Something you clearly never learned." Richard finally spoke up, his voice broken. "Margaret, I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far." "But it did go this far, Richard. You were willing to have me committed to cover your gambling debts. That's not a mistake, that's evil." The room fell silent. Even Patricia's crying had stopped. Bob started gathering the documents. "The will is legal and binding. The restraining order remains in effect. And ladies, if you contest any of this, the investigator's report becomes public record." They filed out slowly, my daughters who were no longer my daughters. After everyone left, Bob walked me to my car. The afternoon sun felt warm on my face, and for the first time in months, I could breathe freely. "Margaret, are you going to be all right? This must be overwhelming." I thought about his question as I unlocked my car door. "Bob, for the first time since Harold got sick, I feel like I can think clearly. They had me doubting my own mind. That's called gaslighting. It's a form of psychological abuse." The clinical term made it sound less personal, but it didn't hurt less. "How long had you known Harold suspected them?" Bob leaned against my car, his expression troubled. "He came to see me privately 6 months ago. He was worried about small things at first, missing items, strange phone calls, pressure to sign documents. I advised him to document everything. He was protecting me even while he was dying. Harold loved you very much. He was terrified of leaving you vulnerable to them." I drove home through familiar streets, past the church where Harold and I were married, past the school where I'd attended parent conferences for Sandra and Patricia, past the park where we'd pushed them on swings and watched them play. When had they stopped being the sweet children I remembered? When had love turned to greed? The house felt different when I walked in. Not empty with grief, but peaceful with truth. I walked through each room, seeing clearly for the first time how many of my treasures had disappeared. The silver frame with my parents' wedding photo, gone. The crystal vase Harold gave me for our 20th anniversary, missing. In my bedroom, I opened my jewelry box. It was practically bare. Sandra had been stealing from me for months, and I'd been too focused on Harold's care to notice. But Harold had noticed. Even sick and in pain, he'd been watching, documenting, protecting me. I found his list tucked in his desk drawer, 3 pages of missing items with approximate dates of disappearance. At the bottom, in his shaky handwriting, "I'm sorry, Maggie. I should have stopped them sooner." The next morning, I called Detective Sarah Chin at the Millbrook Police Department. Harold's documentation was thorough, but I wanted to understand the full scope of what Sandra and Richard had done. "Mrs. Whitfield, I've reviewed the investigator's report. This is more serious than simple theft. Your daughters were planning systematic financial exploitation." Detective Chin spread the evidence across her desk. Bank records, pawn shop receipts, photographs, recorded conversations. Harold and his investigator had built an airtight case. The pawn shop receipts show Sandra sold $23,000 worth of your jewelry over 6 months. She used her maiden name, Whitfield, and claimed she was cleaning out a deceased relative's belongings. The betrayal felt fresh all over again. Sandra had literally sold my memories and used my name to do it. What about Richard's gambling? That's where it gets interesting. Richard owes money to some very unpleasant people. Not just casino debts, private poker games, underground betting. The kind of people who break legs when they don't get paid. My blood ran cold. Are you saying we were in danger? I'm saying Sandra and Richard were desperate enough to commit elder abuse and fraud. People that desperate don't always think about consequences. Detective Chin showed me more photographs. This is Richard meeting with Tony Castellano, who runs illegal gambling operations out of Cleveland. This was taken 2 weeks before your husband died. The photo showed Richard handing an envelope to a man in an expensive suit. Even I could tell from Richard's body language that he was terrified. Sandra knew about the dangerous people? According to our investigation, she was the one who came up with the plan to have you declared incompetent. Richard was just desperate enough to go along with it. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed. Detective Chin, what would have happened if Harold hadn't stopped them? She looked at me with compassion in her eyes. Honestly? You'd probably be in a nursing home right now, confused about why your family abandoned you. Your house would be sold, your accounts emptied, and Sandra and Richard would be in deeper debt because gambling addiction doesn't stop with one big payout. And Patricia? Your younger daughter seems to have been manipulated by Sandra, but she was still complicit. She signed documents, supported false claims about your mental state, and stayed silent while her sister stole from you. Detective Chin handed me a business card. We're filing charges for theft, fraud, and elder abuse. You don't have to testify if you don't want to, but your husband's evidence is strong enough to prosecute without you. I looked at the card, thinking about the sweet little girls who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. What happens to them? That depends on whether they have good lawyers and whether they're willing to make restitution. Word spread quickly through Millbrook. In a town of 8,000 people, news about the Whitfield family drama traveled faster than gossip at a church potluck. I'd expected judgment, whispers, pitying looks. Instead, I found something unexpected: support. Mrs. Henderson from next door knocked on my door with a casserole and tears in her eyes. Margaret, I owe you an apology. Sandra told me you were having memory problems, and I believed her. I even mentioned it to other neighbors, thinking we should keep an eye on you. It's all right, Eleanor. She was very convincing. No, it's not all right. I've known you for 15 years. I should have trusted my own judgment. You've always been sharp as a tack. Eleanor sat at my kitchen table, looking guilty. Sandra was very clever about it. She'd visit you when she knew I was gardening, then stop by my fence to chat. She'd say things like, "Mom seemed confused today," or "I'm worried about Mom forgetting her medications." Did other people believe her? Some did. Dr. Williams mentioned to my husband that he was concerned about your cognitive function based on what Sandra had told him. My heart sank. Dr. Williams had been our family physician for 20 years. Eleanor continued, but Martha Collins from the post office told me something interesting yesterday. Sandra came in 3 months ago asking about forwarding your mail to a P.O. box. When Martha asked why, Sandra said you were moving to assisted living soon. The planning had been even more extensive than I'd realized. Sandra hadn't just been stealing money, she'd been systematically destroying my reputation and preparing for my disappearance from the community. Margaret, there's something else you should know. Several of us have been talking, and we want to help. Help how? We're organizing a support group for older adults who've experienced financial abuse from family members. Turns out, it's more common than anyone wants to admit. That afternoon, 6 women from my neighborhood gathered in my living room. Each had a story of theft, manipulation, or abuse by adult children or relatives. I wasn't alone in this betrayal. Betty Morrison, no relation to Patricia's husband Tom, shared her story of a son who'd stolen her credit cards. Susan Chin told us about a nephew who'd convinced her to sign over power of attorney, then emptied her savings account. The hardest part, Susan said, is that people assume we must have done something wrong. Like we failed as parents, or we're just bitter old women making up stories. I nodded, understanding completely. I keep wondering where I went wrong with Sandra and Patricia. Betty shook her head firmly. You didn't go wrong. Adult children who steal from their aging parents make a choice. It's not about how they were raised, it's about who they decided to become. 2 weeks after the will reading, Detective Chin called with updates on the criminal charges. Sandra and Richard have been arrested. Sandra for theft and elder abuse, Richard for conspiracy and fraud. Patricia is cooperating with our investigation. What does that mean for Patricia? She's agreed to testify against Sandra and Richard in exchange for reduced charges. Apparently, she has recordings of conversations where Sandra planned your institutionalization. I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that Patricia might not be as evil as her sister, but sadness that it had come to family members testifying against each other. Mrs. Whitfield, there's something else. We recovered some of your jewelry. My heart jumped. Really? The pawn shop owner kept detailed records. We've recovered about $8,000 worth of items. Not everything, but some of the pieces with the most sentimental value. That afternoon, Detective Chin brought me a small box containing my mother's wedding ring, my grandmother's pearl earrings, and the sapphire necklace Harold gave me for our 25th anniversary. I cried holding them, not just from happiness at their return, but from grief for what this recovery represented. Bob Hartman called that evening with more news. Margaret, Sandra, and Richard's lawyer contacted me today. They want to discuss a plea bargain. What kind of plea bargain? They're offering to repay everything they stole, plus damages, in exchange for reduced charges. No jail time. I thought about Harold's letter, his fear for my safety, his careful documentation of their betrayal. What would Harold want me to do? Bob was quiet for a moment. Harold wanted consequences. He wanted them to understand the gravity of what they'd done. But he also loved his daughters, despite everything. How much money are we talking about? Between the jewelry, the attempted account manipulation, and damages for emotional distress, their lawyer estimates about $75,000. Do they have that kind of money? Richard would have to sell their house. Sandra would have to liquidate her retirement accounts. It wouldn't be easy for them. I thought about my empty jewelry box, about Harold documenting their crimes while fighting cancer, about the nursing home deposits they'd made in secret. Bob, I'll consider their offer, but I have conditions. The next morning, I sat at Harold's old desk and wrote out my conditions for Sandra and Richard's plea bargain. My handwriting was steady, my thoughts clear. For the first time in months, I felt fully in control of my own life. My conditions were simple but non-negotiable. 1. Full restitution of $75,000, paid within 6 months. 2. Written apologies to every person they'd lied to about my mental state. 3. Community service at the Millbrook Senior Center for 1 year. 4. No contact with me for 5 years minimum. 5. Professional counseling for gambling addiction and family therapy. Bob reviewed my list and nodded approvingly. These are reasonable and focused on rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. Harold would be proud. But when Sandra and Richard's lawyer received my conditions, the response was immediate and ugly. Sandra called me directly, violating the restraining order, screaming into my voicemail, you vindictive old witch. You're trying to destroy our lives. We're your family. I saved the voicemail and called Detective Chin. That was stupid of her, Detective Chin said. Violating a restraining order while facing criminal charges shows incredibly poor judgment. Richard's response came through his lawyer. He was willing to accept my conditions. But Sandra refused, claiming I was being unreasonably cruel and that she would rather go to trial. Fine, I told Bob. If Sandra wants a trial, she can have one. But I won't accept a partial plea bargain. Either they both agree to my conditions, or we let a jury decide their fate. Patricia called me that evening, the first time we'd spoken since the will reading. Mom, Sandra is being stupid. Richard knows he has to accept your terms, but Sandra thinks she can convince a jury that Dad was mentally incompetent when he made the will. What do you think, Patricia? My younger daughter was quiet for a long moment. I think Dad was the sharpest person I've ever known, even while he was dying. And I think Sandra convinced herself that stealing from you was justified because she needed the money. What about you? Were you just following Sandra's lead? I was weak, Mom. I knew what Sandra was doing was wrong, but I didn't want to face conflict with her. I thought maybe you really were getting confused, because it was easier to believe that than to accept that my sister was becoming a criminal. Patricia's honesty was painful but appreciated. The offer stands for both Sandra and Richard, or neither. I'll try to talk to Sandra. She's scared, Mom. Really scared. She should be scared. What she did was unforgivable. But even as I said the words, I heard Harold's voice in my memory. They're still our daughters, Maggie. Broken, but still ours. Sandra's stubbornness lasted exactly 3 days. On Thursday morning, Richard showed up at my door, looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes wrinkled, and his hands shook as he spoke. Margaret, please. I'm begging you. Sandra's pride is going to destroy both of us. I didn't invite him in, the restraining order was still in effect, but I stepped onto the porch to listen. Tony Castellano's people came to our house last night. They gave us 72 hours to pay what we owe, or... He couldn't finish the sentence. Or what, Richard? They'll hurt Sandra. They don't care that she's not directly responsible for my debts. They just want their money, and they know she has access to resources through family. My blood chilled. Despite everything Sandra had done, the thought of violence against her terrified me. How much do you owe them? $83,000 now, with interest. Margaret, if we go to trial, even if we win, it'll take months. We don't have months. Richard broke down crying on my porch. I destroyed everything. My marriage, my family, my wife's relationship with her mother. And now Sandra might get hurt because of my addiction. I thought about Harold's letter, about consequences and justice. But I also thought about the little girl who used to braid my hair and tell me she loved me more than ice cream. Richard, if I help you, what guarantee do I have that you'll get treatment for your gambling? I'll do anything. Rehab, counseling, whatever you want. I just want Sandra safe. What about Sandra? Is she ready to accept responsibility for what she did? Richard wiped his eyes. She's scared, Margaret. Really scared. Not just of the legal consequences, but of losing you forever. She knows she was wrong. That afternoon, Sandra called me herself. Her voice was small, defeated. Mom, I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but I'm so sorry. Which part are you sorry for, Sandra? Stealing my jewelry? Planning to have me committed? Lying about my mental health? Or just sorry you got caught? She was quiet for so long I thought she'd hung up. All of it. I'm sorry for all of it. I convinced myself I was protecting Richard, but I was really just protecting myself from admitting that I'd married someone with a serious problem. Sandra agreed to meet me at Bob Hartman's office the next day, with Patricia present as a witness. For the first time in months, I saw my eldest daughter without the mask of manipulation she'd been wearing. She looked exhausted, older, defeated. When she spoke, her voice cracked with emotion. Mom, I need you to understand something. I didn't start out planning to hurt you. Then how did it start? Sandra took a shaky breath. Richard's gambling got out of control about a year ago. At first, he was winning. He'd come home with extra money, talking about his investment strategies. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. Patricia reached over and squeezed Sandra's hand, a gesture of support despite everything. When did you realize it was gambling? 6 months ago, when the first threatening phone call came. A man with a thick accent told me my husband owed $50,000, and they knew where I worked, where our kids went to school. My heart ached despite my anger. Sandra had been living in fear, just as I had been, but she'd chosen to make me a victim instead of seeking help. So you decided to steal from me? I didn't think of it as stealing at first. I thought I was borrowing. I planned to pay everything back once Richard got help and found another job. But Richard didn't get help. No. He kept promising he would, but the debts kept growing. Every time I gave him money to pay off one debt, he'd use it to gamble instead, thinking he could win big and solve all our problems. Sandra looked directly at me for the first time. Mom, when I started telling people you were having memory problems, I was setting up a justification for taking control of your finances. I told myself it would only be temporary. But you made deposits at nursing homes. Her face crumpled. That was Richard's idea. He said if you were in a facility, we could sell your house and access your retirement accounts as your guardians. I knew it was wrong, but I was so scared of what those people would do to us. Patricia spoke up. Sandra, why didn't you just ask Mom for help? She would have listened. Because I was ashamed. And because... Sandra's voice dropped to a whisper. Because I knew Mom would make me leave Richard, and I wasn't ready to admit my marriage was over. The room fell silent. Bob cleared his throat gently. Sandra, are you ready to accept Margaret's conditions now? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes. All of them. 6 months later, I stood in the Millbrook Senior Center watching Sandra serve lunch to elderly residents. She wore a hairnet and a humble expression, a far cry from the manipulative woman who'd tried to have me committed. The restitution had been paid in full. Richard had sold their house, and they'd moved into a small apartment across town. He was attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings 3 times a week and working at a hardware store, humble employment, but honest work. Sandra's community service wasn't just about punishment. She was learning to see elderly people as individuals with dignity and worth, not obstacles to be managed or manipulated. Mrs. Whitfield, said Agnes Porter, one of the center's regulars. Your daughter has been very helpful. She listens to our stories and treats us with respect. I watched Sandra carefully cut Agnes's sandwich and adjust her napkin. The woman performing these simple acts of service looked like my daughter, but she was someone different now, someone who understood consequences. Patricia had kept her word about staying in contact. She called every Sunday, and we were slowly rebuilding our relationship. Her testimony against Sandra had been difficult but necessary, and I respected her courage in choosing truth over family loyalty. Bob Hartman had helped me establish the Harold Whitfield Foundation, using part of my inheritance to provide legal assistance to elderly victims of financial abuse. Harold's story was helping other families avoid the betrayal we'd experienced. But the most surprising development was a letter I received from Sandra 3 months into her community service. "Mom," she'd written, "I'm learning things about myself that I don't like. In counseling, I'm discovering that I've been manipulative and controlling my whole life, not just during Richard's gambling crisis. I convinced myself I was protecting people, but really I was protecting myself from uncomfortable truths." The letter continued, "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm trying to become the daughter you deserve to have. The woman Dad believed I could be." I kept that letter in Harold's desk drawer, next to his final letter to me. Today marks 1 year since Harold's death, and I'm visiting his grave alone for the first time. The headstone is simple granite with both our names, mine waiting for whenever my time comes to join him. "I did what you asked me to do," I tell him, placing fresh daisies by the stone. "I protected myself. I demanded consequences. But Harold, I'm tired of being angry." The autumn wind rustles through the cemetery trees, and I imagine it's his response. Sandra completed her community service last month and asked if she could visit for my birthday. I said yes. Not because I've forgotten what she did, but because I've learned the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Forgiveness is what I do for myself, letting go of the poison of resentment that was eating away at my peace. Reconciliation is what we might build together if Sandra continues to prove she's changed. Richard completed his gambling addiction program and hasn't placed a bet in 8 months. He's working 2 jobs to pay off the remaining debts to legitimate creditors. The dangerous people have been satisfied with the restitution money. Patricia and I have lunch every Wednesday now. She's learned to stand up for herself, to question Sandra's pronouncements instead of blindly following them. Our relationship is stronger than it was before the crisis. The Harold Whitfield Foundation has helped 12 families in the past year. Each case reminds me that I'm not alone in this kind of betrayal, and that speaking truth can prevent other people from suffering what I endured. I've kept one thing from Harold's investigation, the recording of his voice. Sometimes, when the house feels too quiet, I play it just to hear him say, "Margaret has been nothing but devoted." It reminds me of who I am when the world tries to convince me otherwise. Next week, Sandra will come for birthday cake and coffee. We'll sit at the kitchen table where she once pressured me to sign power of attorney papers, and we'll try to build something new from the wreckage of what we lost. I don't know if we'll ever be mother and daughter the way we were before. But Harold taught me that consequences don't always mean the end of love, sometimes they're the beginning of truth. And truth, as painful as it can be, is the only foundation strong enough to build a real relationship on. If you're watching this and you recognize the signs of financial abuse in your own family, please know that you're not crazy, you're not imagining things, and you deserve protection. Document everything, seek legal help, and remember that setting boundaries isn't cruelty, it's survival. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories, and remember, sometimes the people who love us most need to face the hardest consequences to find their way back to who they're supposed to be.